At the Conference of the Parties COP21 in Paris on December 2015, parties to the UNFCCC reached a landmark agreement to combat climate change and to accelerate and intensify the actions and investments needed for a sustainable low-carbon future. The Paris Agreement builds upon the Convention and, for the first time, brings all nations into a common cause to undertake ambitious efforts to combat climate change and to adapt to its effects, with enhanced support to assist developing countries to do so. The Paris Agreement's central aim is to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by keeping a global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Additionally, the agreement aims to increase the ability of countries to deal with the impacts of climate change and at making finance flows consistent with the low greenhouse gas emissions and climate-resilient pathway. To reach these ambitious goals, appropriate mobilization and provision of financial resources, a new technology framework, and enhanced capacity building to be put in place, thus supporting action by developing countries and the most vulnerable countries in line with their own national objectives. The agreement also provides for an enhanced transparency framework for action and support. The Paris Agreement requires all parties to put forward their best efforts through national determined contributions in DCs and to strengthen these efforts in the years to ahead. This includes requirements that all parties report regularly on their emissions and on their implementation efforts. There will also be a global stocktake every 5 years to assess the collective process towards achieving the purpose of the agreement and to inform further individual actions by parties. The Paris Agreement opened for signature on the 22nd of April 2016 and entered into force on the 4th of November on the same year, 30 days after the so-called double threshold had been met. That is, the ratification by 55 countries that counts for at least 55% of global emissions. Since then, more countries have ratified and continue to ratify the agreement. To this date, 187 parties have ratified of 197 parties to the Convention. The agreement has the following key features. It sets out a long-term goal to put the world on track to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to only 1.5 degrees Celsius. The aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius was agreed to drive greater ambition and to highlight the concerns of the most vulnerable countries that are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. It also sends a clear signal to all stakeholders, inventors, businesses, civil societies, and policymakers that the global transition to clean energy is here to stay, and that resources have to shift away from fossil fuels. With 189 national climate plans covering some 98% of the emission, tackling climate change has now become a truly global effort. With Paris, we're moving from action by a few to action by all. It provides a dynamic mechanism to take stock and strengthen ambition over time. Starting from 2023, parties will come together every 5 years in a global stocktake to consider progress in emissions reductions, adaptation, and support provided and received in view of the long-term goals of the agreement. Parties have a legally binding obligation to pursue domestic mitigation measures with the aim of achieving the objectives of their contributions. The agreement also sets up an enhanced transparency and accountability framework, including the biannual submission by all parties of greenhouse gas inventories and the information necessary to track their progress, a technical expert review, a facilitative multilateral consideration of parties' progress, and mechanism to facilitate implementation of and promote compliance. It provides an ambitious solidarity package with adequate provisions on climate finance and on addressing needs linked to adaptation and loss and damage associated with adverse effects of climate change. To promote individual and collective action on adaptation, the Paris Agreement establishes for the first time a global goal with the aim to enhance capacity, climate resilience, and reduce climate vulnerability. Internationally, it encourages greater cooperation among parties to share scientific knowledge on adaptation as well as information on practices and policies.